Now in your book, it's interesting how like you travel a lot and you've been to like East Timor and the Maldives. Ben,
Maldives, I would say. Yeah.
thank you. But wherever you go, you said that China is still an issue in those countries. Like, tell us about that.
Well, I think we've seen over the last decade or two, China really exert its economic influence, its economic coercion, and what it has done in particular is to essentially, to put it simply, to buy votes at the UN, because through economic investment in places like East Timor and the Maldives and plenty of other places in Asia, Africa, Latin America. We've just seen Xi Jinping in Saudi Arabia these last few days. It has won over to its side countries that might otherwise have spoken out. You would expect Muslim majority countries, for example, to be concerned about the genocide of the Uyghurs, but almost all of them are either silent or worse. I mean, they actually back Beijing when it comes to votes at the UN. So it's achieved that through its extensive economic investments, the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on.
Since you mentioned the UN, you had interviewed a former U.S. representative to the UN who talked about China's infiltration in the UN, and I had no idea it was quite as bad as she described. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so I was really shocked because I knew about the extent of China's influence in terms of positions it holds within different UN bodies and the ability to defeat resolutions. But what I also didn't know was that it basically has penetrated right into the office of the Secretary General. I had always wondered why Antonio Guterres had been so silent on the Uyghur genocide, on Hong Kong, and pretty quiet also on the issues in Burma and North Korea. And I wasn't sure if it was just, he was in a sort of permanent siesta or what was going on. But I learned from the former US ambassador to the Economic, Social and Cultural Affairs Council, Kelly Curry, who told me that essentially there is a Chinese slush fund that contributes millions of dollars through the Secretary General's office, and there's no accountability for this fund. It's for the Secretary General to use for development projects, and the only people who have oversight of the fund are the Secretary General and some Chinese appointees.
That's insane.
How is that okay?
Well, it's not okay, and it shouldn't be okay. And I mean, Kelly Curry is very open to talking about this. She talked to me on the record. I double checked what she had said with me, before publication. And she's offered to talk to other journalists. She actually says that I'm the first person to report what she's claiming, and she hasn't been able to get other journalists to report on it yet. But it's clearly not okay.
Do we know any journalists who would want to talk to her? Wait, us?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, please pass the contact over.
Yeah, absolutely.
I look forward to becoming even more shocked about the state of the UN.
Yeah, it's amazing just how horribly corrupt the UN is.
Well, I mean, I think there had been a bunch of scandals involving China for a number of years ago, too.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the particulars now, but they had definitely gotten in trouble with bribing some officials and things like that.
Yeah. This is kind of on the top of my mind because we talked about it on an episode recently, but just sort of how, like, back in 1999, there was this agreement between the U.S. and China to, if China gives access to the Chinese market to U.S. companies, the U.S. would help push China's entry into the WTO. And that kind of sparked, like, this whole new era of globalization. Globalization was happening, but a new era in globalization where it seemed like people were like, hey, we can find a way to work with dictators and authoritarian regimes, and this will help make those countries, particularly China, it'll help them reform. And now it just seems like, looking back on that, the complete opposite happened. It just spread corruption to every corner of the world.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. I think looking back, the West was incredibly naive. Although having said that, at the time I could understand why they thought this might actually help open China up, because, as I describe in the book, in the last decade of the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, I could see some limited relaxation. There was some, of course, within restrictions. Obviously, the CCP has always been repressive, but and corrupt. But you could see in those years some limited space for civil society, some limited space for some religious practice. Although, of course, the persecution of Falun Gong also began during those years. But I met Chinese human rights lawyers during those years who had some space to actually try to defend human rights cases. But in the last decade or a bit more, all of that has disappeared, and the CCP has really intensified its repression and launched a total crackdown on all of those small openings that we did see during those years. So it does seem now that actually China's economic growth and its access to the WTO has done the opposite of what we all hoped it would achieve, and it's actually led to a corruption of the multilateral institutions and a real threat to our own freedoms, rather than a liberalization of China.
Yeah, I think a lot of things, and I feel like 2008 stands out in my mind when it comes to things like human rights lawyers and things like that, because it seemed that until China kind of cinched the hosting of the Olympics and managed to pull that off, they were a little bit more. I mean, I think that like people were able to try to push the envelope a little bit in terms of some of the civil society issues, but there were obviously still red lines. Like maybe you could defend somebody against a local government who had, you torn somebody's house down, and maybe you could win a case against that. But as soon as you did something like Gao Zhishen had gone from being a lawyer that was like praised by the CCP for taking on some of these like medical malpractice cases and like going against some like corrupt local governments, and then when he started to talk about Falun Gong, like that was, he became a Christian and started talking about Falun Gong, like that was like the absolute line, and then he was disappeared.
Tortured, disappeared.
But it seemed like around 2008, like, and after that, a lot more human rights lawyers started to be disappeared, and that space started to shrink because they had already gotten what they wanted, which was, the fanfare and triumph of the Olympics.
Yeah. Well, I think really, like, you see how China used the money coming in from the West as well as the technology. Once they had that, they were able to build the system they wanted. The systems they put in place to persecute Falun Gong has, then just been expanded to Uyghurs. They built the Great Firewall, thanks to the West again. Like, I don't think zero COVID could have happened if China didn't get the money and the technology from the West that it was getting in that period of time.
I think that's exactly right. And I totally agree about 2008 being the turning point. And I, again, describe this in the book, where partly because of China, the CCP, getting what it wanted, but also I think at the same time, it saw, within China, the Charter 08 movement, Liu Xiaobo, who was, of course, arrested that same year, 2008. And they saw in subsequent years, the various, what we call the color revolutions around the world. And I think it probably felt that they had allowed that space to go too far, and they felt threatened by it, and didn't want an equivalent of a color revolution. And so I think that combination of it having achieved what it wanted to achieve with the Olympics and being fearful of space allowing dissent that could challenge the party caused it to crack down.
So I guess to zoom out again, like you talk about all of these different issues. What do you think? Like, what do you think the advantage is to like looking at China sort of from this macroscopic viewpoint instead of like focusing on like these individual things? Does that help? Do you think that helps create like a better way to like approach and strategize against the Chinese Communist Party? Do you see some kind of through line in like how China's actions in the South China Sea ties to Uyghur persecution, ties to internet censorship?
Yes, I mean, I think it's helpful to see the common thread between all these different issues of repression, persecution, atrocity crimes, and the aggression beyond China's borders. And I think both for the Western reader who wants to understand what's going on in China, seeing these different pieces of the same picture together is helpful. But I also hope that it will encourage greater unity and collaboration, which we are starting to see between these different groups, between Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Falun Gong, Chinese dissidents, and Chinese Christians, and Taiwanese. I mean, I've often said that both among them and among Western democracies as well, I would really like to see us build a united front to counter their united front.
It sounds like what you're talking about is actually the CCP's worst nightmare.
Yes.
Well, every communist society tries to divide people, make them afraid or mistrustful or hate other people, because they understand that once people actually get together, they'll realize that the real enemy is the Communist Party.
I think were we talking to Anna Kwok about this? Like we had Anna Kwok from the Hong Kong Democracy Council on a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, and she was mentioning some of the challenges of building kind of this movement in exile for Hong Kongers. And she said one of the things is that when they were protesting in Hong Kong, there was this sense of like absolute trust among all the protesters and the people supporting the protesters, but that since the protests have ended, the CCP has done their best to kind of sow distrust, and overcoming that is quite a challenge.
Yeah, that they were largely anonymous to each other for security reasons, and then the party finds one person and gets them to reveal information, and then everyone's like, oh, who ratted me out? And it just destroyed the trust of a group that was incredibly close.
Absolutely, and that's what the CCP is incredibly good at doing, and that's why we need to strengthen our efforts to try to prevent that. But I can totally see that building trust is the big challenge in this.